thank you for joining us today for a discussion on music and clowns at Science Gallery Bengaluru's fifth exhibition season, Psyche. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm Gayatri Manu, the Program Associate at Science Gallery Bengaluru, and we are a public institution for research-based engagement. We work at the interface of the natural and human sciences, engineering, and the arts. Before I introduce you to our speakers for this evening, let me encourage you all to sign up for the closing event at Psyche this evening at 6:30 p.m. IST. One of our academic advisors to the exhibition, psychiatrist Vikram Patel, will be delivering a lecture on reimagining the path to recovery. You can find the link to register for this program in the chat. And we are pleased that the DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance is supporting this program as well as the screening of 6 other films as a part of our exhibition season. With that, I'm pleased to invite you all to engage in this film discussion today with filmmaker Alex Widdowson and sociologist Gareth Thomas. Alex Widdowson is a London-based director and animator. He specializes in making animated documentaries about neurological and psychological forms of difference. He's currently a Wellcome Trust PhD candidate on the Autism Through Cinema project at Queen Mary University of London, where he researches the ethics associated with a non-autistic filmmaker representing autism through animated documentary. In addition, he freelances as a 2D animator, teaches MA animation at the University of Hertfordshire, occasionally writes for animateddocumentary.com, and is the festival producer for Factual Animation Film Festival. I'm also pleased to introduce you all to Gareth Thomas, who will be engaging with Alex in a discussion about his film. Gareth Thomas is a senior lecturer in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University. He's a sociologist with broad interests in medicine, disability, and reproduction. Now, Music and Clowns is a very special film, and it's special because we rarely see portrayals of diverse and ordinary lives of people who have Down syndrome. And Alex has produced a film exploring this narrative with his family and his brother, Jamie. And it's a very sensitive and important film to watch. And I'm pleased to also have Gareth in discussion with Alex today. Gareth is uniquely positioned to engage with the film, having had conducted a PhD project on prenatal screenings for people with Down syndrome, or women who are pregnant with children who might possibly have Down syndrome. So I'm sure this is going to be a fascinating conversation. And don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A box, because this discussion will be followed by an interactive chat with the filmmaker and Gareth. With that, I'd like to hand over to Alex to tell us a bit about how the film was made and what his motivations were while creating it. Over to you both.
Oh, thank you so much for the introduction. Okay, so an introduction to the film in my words. Really, I was looking for a project to work on for my master's program at the Royal College of Art in animated documentary. This is a field I've been interested in for maybe 10 years at that point. And originally I'd started using animation as a tool to understand my own experiences of neurodivergence, specifically being sectioned for drug-induced psychosis when I was quite young, at age 20. And so animation was this tool where I could visualize what went on in my mind as I slowly slipped away from reality. And that got me interested in how other people's minds think, and how we're all either slightly different or there can be quite profound differences in the way all of us think. And Music and Clowns, which is named after 2 of my brother's great passions in life, music, and he loves clowns too, came about because I just mentioned Jamie to my class, and everybody suddenly became very engaged. Jamie was just my brother. I didn't really think about how special he was that often. But yeah, he operates on a sort of different wavelength to the rest of our family. He's not particularly verbal. He sort of says maybe a limited range of words, maybe 500. He understands a lot more, but that's just sort of not really his primary mode of communication. But despite these limitations and intellectual disability, he's a really funny guy. He likes to tease, and he likes to be a bit of a trickster. And I guess I was interested in, first of all, using animation to sort of, challenge that idea of, or can I possibly visualize what goes on in someone else's head, particularly if they can't tell me what it looks like. And so it was partly to do with trying to understand the limitations of animated documentary. But also, I was quite interested in my parents' journey. That was quite different from me. Jamie was just part of my life. He's older than me, whereas he was, a baby. He was introduced to them halfway through their lives, and I think that was quite a difficult experience. And as I was doing some research for this film, I realized how big a debate there was around non-invasive prenatal testing, which represents quite a significant improvement in accuracy for screening for Down syndrome during pregnancy. And yeah, I mean, Gareth and I will get into this a little bit more detail, but my main concern was to sort of balance what the doctors were saying, which was that, yes, abortion rates are rising, and there is this risk that the population of people with Downs might be eradicated or reduced, let's say. They wouldn't use that word, but those numbers, that birth rate is dropping. But they said all we're doing is providing accurate information to prospective mothers and families. And my goal was to do the same thing. I wanted to give as honest and as sort of well fleshed out portrait of my brother and what it was like for my parents, and how valuable he is in our family, despite not maybe making a sort of a sort of economic contribution to society. There's all sorts of ways that we measure worth, but I don't think a lot of them really help communicate how amazing my brother is. So yeah, he's more than a diagnosis, and he's more than a sort of a burden on the state, which is one of the sort of most cynical ways of presenting disability. Yeah, so that's a very broad and somewhat unstructured introduction, but maybe I should pass things over to Gareth now.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for the invite. I suppose I should give a little bit of background to myself and why I've been invited to talk about this. So I'm a sociologist based at Cardiff University in the UK, with an interest in a range of subjects, particularly the kind of intersections of medicine, disability, and reproduction. And I think I came at this having done my undergraduate degree in sociology and having taken a few classes where I was taught by a lecturer who then became my PhD supervisor on matters related to stigma. And one of the topics we covered was disability. And it was something that was quite personal to me, because I grew up with someone who has Down syndrome, Brittany, not in the same way Alex did. Brittany wasn't my sibling, but she lived very close and was a very close family friend of mine, and still is. So it was very much informed by this kind of, this academic interest in doing this degree program, but also my interest in disability stemmed from my kind of own personal history as well. So then I did my PhD on prenatal screening for Down syndrome. And since then, I've carried out a few studies, including one recently with parents of children with Down syndrome about their perceptions of kind of wider configurations of Down syndrome, particularly within the media, but also in online spaces as well. So I published on this relatively recently. And actually, when I was asked to watch Alex's film, it was so nice to see so many of the themes that parents have told me about come to life in this 7-minute animation. I really enjoyed the film. You got a sense of Jamie's charisma, his humor as well, that kind of emotional sensitivity that he has. I liked as well that within this program that there wasn't that common narrative that we often have of disability, which follows what is commonly called the medical model of disability, which is grounded in ideas of disability in terms of tragedy and pity and something to be inherently avoided. So it wasn't grounded in this, but equally, what I liked about this film was it didn't shy away from the challenges, not least in the kind of what you might call coming to terms with that, a diagnosis, particularly early on, as Alex explained, in relation to his parents. So I liked that, but I also appreciated the kind of what I would call that mundane portrayal, like the mundane, everyday account of what it's like to live with Down syndrome, in this case, Alex's brother, Jamie. So yeah, I really enjoyed the film. And if you haven't watched it already, I really encourage you to watch it. And I think Alex and I wanted to treat this, the next 30 minutes or so quite more informally, not necessarily having slides, but just kind of chatting about the film, but also our perspectives in relation to disability and Down syndrome. And I think something that Alex touched upon then was non-invasive prenatal testing. So this has been particularly, it's been prominent globally, actually. It's a relatively new form of prenatal screening that's been rolled out. And whilst it's been heralded within the scientific community as a kind of breakthrough, it provides what they call like an earlier, safer, faster result. Equally, there have been concerns raised within disability communities, not least within the UK, a number of Down syndrome advocacy groups about what this means for people who have disabilities, and particularly people who have Down syndrome. And this has led to concerns, as my studies have kind of talked about, around what some parents have called the elimination of people with Down syndrome. So I think that's probably a good place to start, because Alex, remind me if I'm wrong, you said that NIPT, non-invasive prenatal testing, was a kind of motivator for this film, right?
Yeah, so Sally Pierce is like this leading advocate in the UK. She's a comedic actress or actor with a son who is a Down syndrome person or has Down syndrome. Can I just have a little footnote here where I still haven't worked out whether it's best to use person first language or identity first language. I work a lot with the autism or autistic community, where there's a strong preference for saying autistic person, as in this is my identity and it's not something separate to me. And I've not, there isn't a true self somewhere hidden behind the autism. So that's what I'm sort of steeped in at the moment in my research and work. But that isn't a strong theme within the Downs community in the same way, or at least I haven't really found it. And so I think it might also be grammatically a bit difficult to say I'm a Downs person. It doesn't feel quite as right. So for whatever reasons, I think my best judgment tells me I should say person with Down syndrome, it's a person with Down syndrome. So that I'm going to use person first language today. So anyway, carrying on. Gareth, I've forgotten your question now.
The debates around kind of first person language are really interesting. I know this is a bit of an aside, but particularly within kind of the field that I'm engrossed in at the moment, like disability studies, there's a strong preference for using the term disabled people, because it flags up that people are disabled by society, whereas a person with a disability is seen as kind of relying on quite a medical conception of what it means to have a disability. But equally, the parents I talk to very much align with the position you just said, Alex, about they don't like the term Down's person. They prefer to say my child who has Down syndrome. But again, really thorny issue that's not going to be resolved anytime soon. And actually within, of course, disability is a broad church. It's such a broad category that actually there's different groups within that, and even intra and inter kind of conflicts can emerge there. So even within a whole group, certain people may align with different ways of thinking. So it's a thorny issue that we're definitely not going to resolve in 30 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'm going to use both interchangeably, and I can be criticised by both sides. There you go.
There you go. But the question is around the kind of motivator, particularly around like NIPT. I think you started with Sally Phillips, prominent kind of cultural commentator.
Yeah, that's right. And she had this quite fascinating documentary called A World Without Down Syndrome from, I think, about 2014, which was a big inspiration to get started on my film. Now, she's been criticized for focusing on the sort of cultural and economic value that's sort of untapped within the Downs community, and there's basically a sort of economic argument there, which just will not apply to people whose disabilities stop them from contributing economically or in sort of cultural senses that she's referring to. And I think that reflects her position as a parent of a son whose disablement doesn't stop him really getting in the way of doing his GCSEs and exams and going to other educational opportunities and work opportunities. I think he wants to be an actor. So, so she was focusing on sort of one group within the within the Down syndrome community. And also, Sally's quite upfront in most of her work about her Christian ideology, and it sort of has a sort of pro-life content to it, which is something that I'm not a pro-life advocate. In fact, I'm pro-choice, just broadly speaking, but it all then gets very complicated when sort of women's rights intersect with what's hard to describe any other way than eugenics, which is sort of selecting for what kind of humans do we want to be born or want to exist, and making those choices about what kind of humans are valid and which ones aren't is always basically eugenicsy, and it gives me a lot of discomfort. But equally, at the same time, when I talk about these topics, I'm very conscious of my sort of feminist education, and I don't want to be getting in the way of anybody's sort of body rights. It's just there's maybe more than two sides to this coin, but it's a very complicated issue. Yeah,
it is a very thorny issue, and it's one I've been grappling with for a long time, and I've talked at length with several parents about healthcare professionals who are delivering news around a diagnosis, or at least even delivering the prenatal screening program. And I think the debate around prenatal screening is often seen as quite there's a binary. You're either pro-life or pro-choice, and actually there's so much in between there. And I think that that's where I sit with it. It's sounds similar to you, Alex. I kind of very much pro-choice in terms of ensuring people have the possibility of making a choice about this, because you're not going to be able to get rid of prenatal screening or testing. It's here to stay. But in order to ensure that choice is as informed as possible, is about providing that that balanced, accurate information. And I think for a lot of parents, that's where the information or that's where it falls down, is that we're still getting quite negative images of what it's like to live with a disability, not just Down syndrome, but within our society more broadly. We still occupy quite, at least within the UK context where Alex and I are based, it's still a disableist society in lots of different ways. Not least in something you touched upon there, Alex, I think, in terms of how contributions are seen. This is very much informed by kind of neoliberal values, and that's coming, in terms of how we see worth through purely economic means, through getting into work, essentially. And that's not always possible for, certain people. So the debates around, this new technology are very thorny. And I think the kind of term eugenics is helpful here, in the sense of, I think when people hear the term, they often go back to, the likes of Nazi Germany in 1945 and the extermination, elimination of the Jewish population, but also of disabled people and others. But of course, it has a longer history than that, even within British politics. And what you can argue is that perhaps if we are to take eugenics at its definition, which is the kind of promotion of the reproduction of certain populations and the deterring the reproduction of populations with what is seen as, in inverted commas, undesirable traits, you can see how that word might be mobilized in a helpful way to think about what's going on with prenatal screening and testing now. And that doesn't mean to completely eradicate it, but it is to say we need to get more information out there about what it's like to live with disability that gives people that clearer picture. And I think that's something that you've mentioned before, Alex, in terms of the use of the arts to provide that information, not necessarily just like a leaflet that you get given in a clinic. Would that be a fair reflection?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had this sort of daydream as I was making the film that maybe this can be sent to people with the test results, and along with a leaflet all about the diagnostic sort of traits and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know if it is a fair and balanced representation. I'm obviously very biased towards my brother and love him, and I'm very happy he exists. And so it does that. Maybe it can be used in combination with something which is very clinical and scientific in its sort of representation. I think I've always framed this as a sort of humanist approach to provide information relative to the sort of diagnostic information.
And I think that's a key point there. It's not just the information, you know, people's choices aren't necessarily just informed by what they get in a clinic, for example. It's informed by the wider social context. And so it's informed by kind of media configurations of what it's like to live with disability or Down syndrome. So I wanted to ask you in terms of, you know, those wider kind of cultural outputs, whether it's, you know, film or TV or so on. Is the film has been inspired by that in terms of maybe a dissatisfaction with what those wider representations are like, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this film in particular, you didn't really see that much about Down syndrome. You know, there's one actor in the UK who gets lots of work, Tommy, I forget his surname.
Tommy Jessup.
Yeah. And he's in Call of Duty and a few other a few like cop procedural dramas, and actually the way he's represented is very tragic, and his character is constantly being exploited by criminals. But there's not that much else really. I mean, there's a few short films that come out every now and then, particularly, you know, similarly aligned with my aspirations. You know, isn't my family interesting? My brothers or my sister, this is what their life is like. Aren't they wonderful? And I guess I'm fitting into a sort of subgenre of short film there. But I think since there was a film, Peanut Butter Falcon, that came out since I made my film, which I thought was pretty good, actually, pretty exciting. A sort of a buddy movie, a road story that represented Downs in a way that had nothing to do with pity or the sort of tragedy, or, you know, it's all about two oddballs on the road it was a bit like Easy Rider, basically.
Was it Shia LaBeouf?
Yeah, Shia LaBeouf.
Yeah,
and,
I thought so, yeah.
And another actor whose name I don't know. Yeah. But it was a good film, yeah. So I think it is getting better, yeah. But definitely, yeah, it was very obvious there wasn't that much out there. And so there was this gap in the market I was trying to fill.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of reflects what several of the parents who I talked to as part of my work have said as well. They said actually they felt that there was more out there more recently, not necessarily just in terms of TV and film, but things like advertising campaigns, you know, seeing people with disabilities, particularly Down syndrome, in kind of advertisements or TV programs. But they said that kind of exposure in their view, can be a positive thing, because it has the potential to bust myths, to challenge kind of tragic conceptions of what it's like to live with a disability. But they they had some disclaimers on top of that they wanted to add. One being that, exactly as you touched upon, there is a worry sometimes that they rely on those kind of stereotypes of what it means to have a disability, particularly in terms of vulnerability, So I think one of the examples they gave was from a kind of popular soap opera here in the UK, where they had someone with Down syndrome on the show, but they were missing. They'd wandered off, and the storyline was very much grounded in this kind of idea of vulnerability, of pure lack of independence, rather than of interdependence or anything like that. It was, and for them, they felt like it was a missed opportunity. So there was things like that, but there was also concerns around tokenism, of purely including someone on the basis of having disability rather than on their ability as an actor or as an actress. And there was also a sense, I think, that there was a potential departure from, by focusing on more positive images of what it's like to live with Down syndrome. Ostensibly, that's a good thing, but there was a worry possibly that it might detract from kind of addressing deep-seated kind of structural problems in our society. So just to give an example of that, they would say, I remember talking to one parent who was like, oh, it's great seeing, the families on This Morning, singing, families of children with Down syndrome, singing and having a good time. But what I don't need people on, I don't need that. What I need is ensuring they've got a good education, ensuring they've got access to the right healthcare, making sure that they are able to live well. And so it was kind of flagging up that we still inhabit a society which has disableism at its core. And I was wondering, Alex, if that was something that you or your parents have kind of talked about, or that you felt was reflected in the film or anything.
Yeah, I mean, ableism, or I mean, you use the word disableism. I use the word ableism, and I think we mean the same thing, basically.
Yeah, it's interchangeable, I think.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, I've got much more into the neurodiversity paradigm, which is sort of in opposition, or maybe sort of a new stance relative to the medical paradigm for understanding disability. That's become a sort of topic of interest in my PhD on autism representation. But if I'm honest, my parents and we didn't talk that much about ableism because he isn't talking about it. He isn't talking about the way in which he's discriminated against. And I think if he is aware of it, he's not communicated it to us. So it's not something we thought about all the time. My dad basically just thinks it's really great for Jamie he never stopped Jamie like going up, and he's very friendly and just likes shaking hands with strangers, particularly if they're in uniform. So he loves police officers. And my dad always said, well, it's just good for them, that everybody needs a bit of Jamie in their lives, and maybe they get a bit shocked and a bit scared or not used to this sort of pattern of behavior, but they should be, and they should be willing to accept sort of deviations from sort of neurotypical norms, basically. So that's about as far as we got in the family talking about ableism. But yeah, since then, I mean, I've been working on the Autism Through Cinema project, and actually we have a podcast where we discuss tropes and ableism within cinema, and autistic presence and representation, and often we go beyond the topic of autism into other forms of neurological difference. And yeah, we're quite interested in how far things have come since Rain Man in 1987, where you had to be some sort of genius to justify your place as a disabled adult or autistic person. And I'm glad that's gotten better, but it's still not perfect. It's been 2 years since Sia released a dreadful film about autism that was quite dangerous, actually. And that was called Music, and I don't recommend anyone watches it.
I don't think I've seen that. What is the film?
So Sia is the lead singer of some Australian music outfit, and she's transformed into a film director, and her debut featured her young muse, who was like a 14-year-old when they started working on this, I think. And yeah, rather than casting an autistic actor, or she just worked with Maddie Ziegler to try and sort of perform autism, non-speaking autism autistic traits, and it was all very awkward and sort of like, it was like cripping, basically, is the word, like performing somebody else's disability. And it was very uncomfortable to watch, combined with these sort of fantastical music scenarios where we're supposed to be entering into the mind of this autistic person. And yeah, it was horrific. And then also there's, on top of it, some very dangerous restraint scenes within the film, which should never be replicated and have put people's lives in danger in the past, which I think were cut out. And the only consultation Sia did was really to work with Autism Speaks, which is one of the most controversial autism charities out there in the world, who strongly advocate eugenics and ABA, and which is sort of like Pavlovian training, basically train the autistic traits out of you, which has been compared to torture by a lot of autistic survivors. So just not a good run, basically. And it's one of the, it has been a valuable film in a sense because it drew mainstream media to do their attention towards just how active the sort of neurodiversity movement is these days, and how willing and well mobilized these people are to sort of fight for their rights. So it's great, really.
Yeah, I think I'd heard about the film. I hadn't seen it, but I forgot it was Sia in it, but it sounds like something that I don't want to watch. Anyway,
yeah, I mean, it's like a car crash. Maybe sometimes it is hard not to look at these things, but you wouldn't watch it you'd watch it to see how awful she did it.
I know something you said in the blurb as well of your film was about the common images that we do get in film when it comes to disability. The idea of kind of blindness or deafness, I think, or like the someone in a wheelchair, or kind of mental illness with no sign of physical abnormality. So again, was the film that you produced and the podcast that you're running now, is that part of that narrative as well? Is it to try and kind of get representations in where potentially people with disabilities are maybe not as well? I guess you said in the case of Jamie, he's not necessarily as verbal as maybe some of the other kinds of people with disabilities we're used to coming across in kind of more popular configurations. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a sense, I mean, I think our audience is mostly autistic people, so we're preaching to the choir to some extent, and so it's hard to know. But broadly speaking, like our research project around autism, the Autism Through Cinema research project at Queen Mary, is focused on raising people's awareness around the social model of understanding disability in relation to autism, and particularly the neurodiversity paradigm. So that's the sort of ideological undertones, but really we're sort of finding ways to sort of just show that being autistic is not a sort of negative thing. It's just a minority group, or you're part of a minority group, and the same argument goes for Down syndrome. It's a form of difference, not a way of being inferior. And if we really lived in a fair society, our energy would be focused on making sure everyone who enters our society is given the resources they need to live comfortably, whether you are disabled in a way that stops you working, or you just have a real thirst for education and you don't have money, like that would be the ideal sort of socialist society I'd like to live in. But there's various degrees of success that you can go along the way towards. And I think at one time, the UK was very good at those sorts of things, and we're not so good at it right now because of a political shift. But yeah, I mean, I think that there should be nothing wrong with having or being a Down syndrome person or having Down syndrome, and there should be nothing wrong with being autistic. It's just I think, well, I'm in autism and the neurodiversity paradigm or the movement. I think it's borrowing a lot of tricks from the gay rights movement, actually, and sort of first of all trying to address the idea that questioning its sort of the sort of ableism involved in the diagnostic category, and questioning whether or not it really is a disorder, which I think was very successfully achieved, at least by the 90s in the gay rights movement, and is only really just happening now. Lots of autistic people, I'm not autistic myself, but I am schizoaffective, and I don't use the word disorder to describe myself anymore. I just like being different, or don't even use a word. I just say I'm a schizoaffective person. Yeah.
I think you've kind of flagged up the power of words there in terms of how they're used to describe particular persons or particular conditions, and that was something that the parents were really keen on highlighting. I know we've already talked about like person first language, which a number of the parents were very keen on, but also they were very eager and to avoid and critical of those who use terms like suffering. So they said they saw this quite a lot in certain publications in the UK, particularly kind of newspaper outlets would say the person suffering with Down syndrome. And they said that, there was a real pushback against that. And it was trying to show their life in more affirmative terms. And there were different ways of doing it. It was correcting people when they use the term, sometimes relatively innocently and inadvertently. They were like, we don't suffer. We have challenges, but every child had, there are challenges with every child. Would often be a retort to that particular kind of when people use those terms, but also just there was a few parents who said they'd go on social media and they'd provide those more affirmative accounts of what it's like to live with a child who has Down syndrome. Some of them explicitly addressing those terms by including hashtags like hashtag not suffering, with a picture of their child maybe eating an ice cream, doing what we would consider to be relatively ordinary things. So yeah, that the power of language, I think, is something that, particularly in my work, but the parents are really attend to, and that can really cause damage. And actually, they say it's not just the language, but it's actually something you talked about earlier, Alex, with you in relation to your parents. They said it was very rare for them to come across, to have a social encounter that would be negative with kind of general members of the public, and they put that down to a more kind of what they perceived as maybe a more tolerant society to disability, at least in kind of their everyday interactions in their local communities and so on, and more kind of public knowledge of what it means to live with disability. They said the problem, of course, there might be one or two negative instances. They said the problem was interacting with what they called the system, which is, again, trying to access resources. And that is something that you talked about there, something that's become increasingly fraught in the UK context, kind of given political climate.
I mean, my parents basically developed a second career in learning how to navigate sort of local authorities, and my dad ended up becoming, I think, a vice chairman of local chapter of MenCap, just because it was really beneficial to just know how the whole system ran. And he then had a lot of knowledge, I think, and tried to help other people. But yeah, I guess when the negotiations were always happening, I mean, Jamie's 10 years older than me. I was too young to really pay much attention. But all I knew is that there was this dramatic sort of moment, at one point where they had to put a lot of pressure on the local authority, and it paid off in terms of establishing Jamie in assisted living. So he now lives maybe about a mile away from my parents with another guy, a Downs guy, and he's quite happy there now. I mean, it's not the first place he's lived. He had a difficult relationship with one of his flatmates in the previous property, but yeah, that getting into that situation was very, very tricky, and it took a few years planning and preparation and work. But yeah, I mean that's the hardest thing. Yeah, I mean, we were talking about, every child is a challenge. My mum always said that Jamie was way more mellow than the rest of us. I mean, one thing that's not reflected in the film is that actually there's 4 children in my family, and I'm the youngest, and Jamie's the oldest. We have 2 siblings in between, but I'm afraid their narratives were not very interesting because, like me, Jamie had just always been a part of their lives, and there was no great arc of experience that came that my parents went through. So, I mean, there are reasons they got cut for the film, but sorry, Sophie, sorry, Guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was something that kind of parents were really key to identify there, which I think you touched upon. Actually, sometimes they didn't have this great arc, I think you called it, or like these kind of these specific moments where things happen. They talked about how their everyday lives were relatively normal in that sense, and kind of mundane. And actually, one of the things I think they wanted to get across to me was that there wasn't necessarily things out of the ordinary here. There were challenges, of course there were, things like medical appointments and added health complications when you have a disability. But yeah, they said similar things, Alex. They said, actually, we've got siblings, and their child who has Down syndrome is by far the easiest. The problem comes when trying to access particular resources. The metaphor they used a lot was fights and battles. And lots of them use those independently without me using those terms. And, there wasn't an awareness that other people were using them. They just talked about how it's fights and battles, and they were exhausted. Lots of the times, because they just had to battle so much stuff and so many resources. And I think that for them was what is kind of reflected in a society that still doesn't necessarily value disabled people in the way that it should. And I think if we want a telling example of that, we can think about things like the COVID-19 pandemic and the disregard of disabled people, particularly people with learning disabilities, who've died at a much higher rate than those without learning disabilities. And that's not just confined to kind of what you might consider medical issues. Actually, it's grounded in things like not sure if you remember, but early in the pandemic, there were certain homes where people with learning disabilities lived where there were blanket do not resuscitate disorders. Blanket do not resuscitate orders that were implemented for them and for older people living in homes. There was the early language as well. So Kirsty Lydiard is a disability studies scholar who talked about the language, things like underlying health conditions, and herd immunity, and how these discourses were particularly prominent in the UK public imaginary, and how that produced an idea that was, to put it very bluntly, the rest of us will be fine. It's just the people with disabilities who will end up, potentially dying from this condition. It was almost seen as they were collateral. And she said they were really kind of ontologically very violent messages against people with disabilities. So there's been that kind of symbolic mistreatment, but also that physical mistreatment as well. This blanket do not resuscitate disorders. So I think if you want to see how society treats its most vulnerable populations, you can just look at the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, really horrendous. I mean, I think the idea of slow violence it's borrowed from sort of geology, really, this idea of like the destruction of environments happening so incrementally that you don't really there's no day-to-day moment where you can sort of spot it, but it gradually builds up, and I think that concept applies quite well, I think, to the way that sort of themes around eugenics sort of creep into popular discourse and affect policy. And it's
Yeah.
quite horrendous.
It is, and it's easy to kind of get really bogged down with this stuff and get really pessimistic. But that's why, to bring this back to your video, it's lovely seeing outputs like this that provide that more affirmative account that doesn't shy away from those challenges that you might face, but also that isn't grounded in self-pity or tragedy, or it gives that more it gives personhood, I think, to people with Down syndrome and disability, in this case Jamie, of course. But that's why I think more outputs like this are needed. So
right.
Thank you, Gareth and Alex, for that fascinating conversation. While I wait for the audience to share their questions in the Q&A box, I thought I might ask you a few questions myself. So Alex, of course, one of the things that I was wondering was about Jamie's involvement in the film. So right at the beginning, you speak to him and you ask him about whether he's all right with you making this film, and then he sort of smiles and then he kisses the microphone. And while this might not come off as verbal sort of explicit consent, that it must have, it in some ways shows his enthusiasm about this whole project. But I also wonder, when you were making this film, if you grappled with that question about whether he might in fact be able to legally give consent to you for making this film, and was that a concern for you while you were making it?
Yeah, it was a huge concern for me, really. I did everything I could to seek consent, and I recorded that moment, and it seemed, at the very, very least, it was a gesture of assent, which is a sort of positive indication, whatever. But then if you try and contextualize that, well, does Jamie understand that this film might be seen by hundreds of thousands of people that he's never met? Or does he know? He really loves family videos, and one of his favorite things to do was to get the recording of his sort of, I think it was his 20th birthday, maybe it was 18th birthday, and just bring that out and watch that on the VHS player. And so, in a sense, I was very aware that a film about him and his life is something that very much chimes with his existing interests. And I did try my best to get his consent, and when he kissed the microphone, I thought, oh yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe that is him saying yes. But he did it again another time, and I realized, maybe he's just learnt that this is a kooky, fun, hilarious thing to do, and he knows it gets a good laugh. And I think I think someone said he might have even done it on a stage once, where there was a sort of amplifier attached to it. So it's genuinely hard to know, and I assumed his capability of providing consent, and augmented that with our parents' decision that was aligned with his assent. So multiple sources pointing in the same direction that he was up for it.
Got it. And I also wonder what was his reaction to seeing the film being screened at various venues. How did he feel about seeing himself on screen in front of so many people? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so the first sort of complete screening, he'd seen work in progresses a few times. But when the film was finished and it was in the degree show at the Royal College of Art, I actually took all the bed sheets and some of his possessions from my parents' house where he used to live, and we set up this installation, which so it looked a lot like his bedroom in the exhibition space. And you get to sit down on the side of this little bed and watch it on a screen in front of you, with headphones. And I remember that time when we screened it, I think it was the first time it had been complete, and he was sort of lighting up at the moments where ABBA appeared and when there were clowns there. But it sort of, he was, you could see he's building up to like saying ABBA or commenting in some way. But then it moved on already. And I think my goal wasn't really to make a film that is for Jamie as an audience. It was really a wider public audience I was interested in. And I think if I was trying to make a film for Jamie, it might be quite different and would need way more experimentation and research to try and suss out what his sort of perfect. I mean, I kind of know what his perfect film is. It's Mr. Bean. That really resonated with him. So it would be, a bit less verbal, a little bit more physical humor, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I also wonder if you incorporated any of his drawings or sketches in the film, because I noticed that there's that one bit where the characters are introduced in the film and it has a very different style of animation compared to the rest of the film. So was that a part? I mean, did you incorporate any of his sketches?
Yeah, so those drawings were done by him as a kid, when he was I don't know how old he was, maybe a teenager. And I placed them onto my graphics tablet and was tracing them to build these character designs. So there is some sort of indexical contact between his drawing and the digital film, in a way, if you include tracing. But yeah, I think it's interesting. What does that signify? Does it show? I mean, it was like the scene where we get closest to his perspective. And so I thought using his drawing was a nice sort of symbolic substitute for his perspective, when obviously he doesn't see like that. He doesn't see the world in his sort of drawing style. It's just silly. That would not make sense at all. But it was a sort of symbol for his sort of dominance in that scene. And then later when we do explicitly talk about, I wonder how he sees the world. I wonder what he thinks about. It just goes totally abstract because we genuinely haven't got a clue. Like, there's no way of knowing, and I didn't want to make claims that I couldn't really substantiate.
So Alex, also you, are a filmmaker who has made documentaries about neurological and psychological differences. So can you speak a little more about your filmography and where Music and Clown sort of is situated within that?
Yeah, so I mentioned this very briefly. I'm schizoaffective, and I was sectioned when I was 20 for psychosis. And that happened twice, actually, once in 2008 and once in 2010. And I went to do a fine art course afterwards and slightly beforehand, but it's got complicated. And I just sort of decided it was going to be art therapy and self-administered art therapy the whole 3 years. And I spent the first year doing lots of experimentation, not really knowing what I was doing. And I was lucky enough that one of my tutors was also supervising a very important PhD in animated documentary, something that I reference a lot in my own writing, by Samantha Moore. And she just mentioned animated documentary and showed me a few examples, and I was like, yeah, here we go, this is my thing, I can do this. And it's this perfect medium for communicating what it was like to be mad and hallucinate and have very strange beliefs. And yeah, so I discovered this perfect medium. I then made these very intimate, exposing films that were quite hard to show people outside of an educational context. And so I think it made it difficult for me to apply for jobs in an animation studio because I didn't necessarily like sending those videos off. But I did get very much into the sort of academic world and writing world of animated documentary and carried on making those kind of films. and I made some films about addiction. I got closely affiliated with the Philadelphia Association, which was founded by R.D. Laing, who's a sort of famous anti-psychiatrist. And I was working a lot with those therapists there through this artist residency. So one of them was an addiction specialist, so I worked with them on that. It was called The Art of Addiction, Escapology, yeah. And that was a short that was released by Vice in the end. And I made another film supported by the Wellcome Collection and the PA about critical psychiatry and therapeutic communities, which were still being run by the PA. And then by the time I got to this film, I just thought it would be nice to not be writing about, or not be making films explicitly about madness or my own sort of things that, well, I mean, Down syndrome does affect me directly, but it felt a little bit more ambitious to get away from my own experience and talk about my brothers. So that was helpful. But then since then, I've tried to work with topics that I'm not directly related to at all. So autism, I'm not autistic. I mean, I am neurodivergent, and a few people I've met think I might be autistic, but it's always speculation. But yeah, I'm on that project really trying to work out what does it mean to speak for or speak with people in a group that you're not a member of, and how can you acknowledge those ethical risks and compensate for them. Yeah.
I think we're approaching we're approaching the end of the session. So I'd like to wrap up by thanking you both, Alex and Gareth, for coming on board and having this extremely important and pertinent conversation. I think we haven't had a film like this shown at our exhibition season, and it really adds value in what Gareth said, of course, that you are able, Alex, to bring in the full personhood of someone who lives with Downs, and that's very important. In rejecting the medicalized narrative, we're able to see someone's full humanity, and it's important to see beyond caricatures for that reason. So I'm very excited and I'm delighted that we were able to have you both on board today. And thank you so much, Gareth, for bringing in your expertise and engaging with Alex and being so generous with your questions. We really appreciate it. If any of you missed watching the film, we would encourage you to watch it. It's online only until the end of today, so you have another 6 to 12 hours. So don't forget to go check it out. Our exhibition closes this evening. So do join us for the closing lecture delivered by psychiatrist Vikram Patel. We hope to see you at our future programs. Thank you, Alex and Gareth, once again. And I hope you all have a good Sunday evening. Do take care.
Oh, well, thank you so much as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gareth, for the great questions.
Thank you, Alex. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, cool.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.